Hello, everyone. So my name is Taylor. I'm currently a graduate student at Kansas State, and today I'm going to be presenting my master's thesis for you. So I'm really excited to share it. We're going to be talking about the role of top-down processes on attentional selection during film viewing, and if that comes at a cost or not for you. We will start by talking about attention very broadly. So there are two types of attentional processes, bottom up, which is stimulus driven, so things like motion or color, and then top down, which is driven by a participant's knowledge, experience, goals. And I'm particularly interested in top down attention, to which there have been identified two types of top down attention more recently. So you have volitional attention, which is an effortful process, oftentimes goal-driven, and it requires a willful shift of someone's attention. Then you have mandatory attention, which is more effortless, often based on knowledge or experience. Excuse me. And these differences in top-down attention have been found when viewing images, but when viewing film, so dynamic images, it's found that participants rarely deviate from focal narrative elements. Attentional synchrony has been kind of the term for this, where participants often are looking at the same places at the same times during a film clip. But with this, we also have the tyranny of film, which says even though attentional synchrony is occurring, there are differences in comprehension for participants. So if we look at, I will play this video for you. You can see with the heat map, participants are looking at that red area is where most participants' eye movements are falling. And you see there's not a lot of difference in what they're looking at or when they're looking at it. So this is attentional synchrony. Tyranny of film would say that, yes, this is occurring, but their comprehension could still be different for that film clip. So this taken together suggests that there's little role, if any role, for top-down processes to actually influence attention during film viewing. So when looking specifically at volitional top-down attention, this is the manipulation of a goal or a task. There has been some evidence that shows that when given a task at odds with comprehension, that participants' eye movements will deviate from focal narrative elements. So one study found that when told to take the viewpoint of an interior designer versus an private investigator, eye movements did differ for those two viewing conditions. And similar things were found even within our own lab, where we had participants drawing a map of a film clip. So in this map, they were looking for spatial locations and objects and spatial relationships as opposed to the main narrative elements. And here we did find that when given that task, there was a role for this top-down attention, specifically volitional attention, to have an effect on what people were looking at. So this suggests that volitional attention is not a naturally engaged in process, especially during film viewing. And it would suggest that it potentially requires executive resources to complete, and because of that willful shift that it demands of a participant. So then moving into the mandatory top-down attention, we will be, we'll be primarily interested in the effect of culture. So there is a portion of the research that shows there are differences between East and Western cultural differences in attentional selection when using photographs, not really when using film stimuli though. But this research shows that Western participants tend to focus on and remember more central narrative elements more, whereas Eastern participants tend to focus or remember more background elements. Conversely, there's a portion of this research that shows that there's no real difference between Eastern and Western cultures, and that they tend to actually prefer the central narrative related objects of an image to about the same degree. So they found no differences in fixation durations, the number of fixations, or even the difference between fixations occurring to the background or the central elements. So we're going to take the stance that Eastern cultures may spend relatively more time in Western cultures exploring the background, though the research is very mixed. So with all of this, we do have two research questions. The first one is to identify what roles do mandatory versus volitional top-down attention play in attentional selection during film viewing, if any. And the second research question is this volitional attention cognitively demanding while viewing film specifically? So to get into hypotheses, we have several hypotheses here. So the first set, we have top-down attention hypotheses. So in the volitional attention hypothesis, this says that when participants are given a goal that is at odds with comprehending the film, that volitional attention task, we will see significantly different eye movements compared to participants who were not given a goal at odds with comprehending the film. We also have the mandatory attention hypothesis, which says that there is a role for cultural background when viewing film, and that we will find differences between participants of different cultural backgrounds. So then with these themselves are not competing hypotheses, but they do share a competing hypothesis. So the tyranny of film hypothesis is going to say that even though they have these large differences in cognition based either on the task or the goal that they have or their cultural background, there's going to be little to no difference in their eye movements because of those really, really strong bottom-up features of like motion specifically for film. So then getting into our cognitive load hypotheses, we have the limited resource hypothesis, which says that participants are going to show an overall decrease in their attentional breadth as their cognitive demand increases because they only have so many resources that they can work with at any given time. Additionally, we have the executive control of eye movement hypothesis, which says that we'll find an interaction between the presence of a cognitive load and the task that participants are completing. So specifically, when completing that task at odds with comprehension, that volitional attention task, and a cognitive load task, there should be a larger drop in their overall attentional breadth because that volitional attention task is more demanding than the mandatory task, okay? So then to do all of this, we had participants from Kyoto University and Kansas State. We tracked their eyes. We gave them mapping comic sheets, which I will discuss on the next slide a little bit. And then we used an auditory in-back as our cognitive load manipulation. So here participants were presented with these auditory letters. And when you hear a letter that matches, in our case, it's going to be two back. They would make a button response. So at that second M in this picture, they would make a button response saying, yes, I heard the same letter 2 letters back. And then we also had 8 film clips, and these had no edits or cuts. They are more naturalistic, like long shots. So our comic and map sheets are going to demonstrate the goal manipulation, so that volitional task that we gave participants. So on the left, we have what a participant could draw for a volitional attention task, where they're drawing the map of the objects and locations of a film clip. And on the right, we have what would happen if we are just asking them to comprehend the film. So in this condition, we had participants draw us a 4-panel comic of the main narrative events. And I will say that these are taken from the same video, and these are both very good sort of exemplars of what we would expect to see. Performance did vary vastly on these tasks, but these are at least good representative examples of what an ideal participant would be providing for us. So altogether, our participants would watch the 8 film clips. On all of those film clips, they would complete their primary task, so that map or that comic, where they would watch the video with that goal in mind and then complete that task right after each video. On either the first 4 or the second 4 videos, participants would be completing that secondary task, which was that 2-back cognitive load. And this was, again, either all 4, the first 4 or all of the last 4. Then participants completed summaries, a working memory test, as well as cultural demographic survey. So to get into the results, I'm going to be specifically talking about the 2-back experiment where we found effects of culture, task, and cognitive load. We do also have a 1-back experiment as well. If that's something that you wanted to talk about during the live discussion, I'm more than happy to do that. But I'm going to focus on this for the time frame that I'm given today. So again, as a reminder, the 2-back, when they've heard the same letter 2-back, they would make a button response. So the results that we find, our figures are going to look pretty similar. We'll have our main outcome is proportion of deviation. We're using proportion to control for differences in lab setups between the 2 locations. Then we have the figure itself is split by Kansas on the left, Kyoto on the right. We have the condition that they were in, either comic or map. And then we have the cognitive load they were experiencing. Either the red bars will be when they had the cognitive load, and the blue bars will be when they did not have the cognitive load. So first, we do show support for the mandatory attention hypothesis, where overall Kansas has a higher deviation compared to Kyoto. We also have support for the volitional attention hypothesis, where only for our Kansas participants, but we see that overall, when in that volitional task, so that map task condition, participants are deviating more compared to when in the just comprehension comic condition. Then we do have also support for the limited resource hypothesis, and this shows that when in those trials with the NBAC compared to when they had no NBAC, we do see that there is less deviation overall when under that NBAC, suggesting that that NBAC is decreasing their attentional breadth. Then we also do have support for the executive control of eye movement hypothesis. This is only for our Kyoto participants. So specifically when in that dual task, when completing the volitional map task and the cognitive load 2-back task, we do see a larger drop in their overall deviation compared to when they're completing the comic task. So this suggests that that volitional map task is cognitively demanding for participants to engage in, which is why it may not be something they do naturally. Interestingly, though, this is only for Kyoto participants that we find that it is a demanding process. So to kind of review here, we did find replication and extension of previous research on volitional control, but we did add more videos and we did it across multiple labs, suggesting that it is a real effect that exists. And we did find support for cultural differences on attention, where overall Kansas was deviating more compared to Kyoto. And we did also find partial support for the volitional control being cognitively demanding. This was only for our Kyoto participants, though, and this is what is going to kind of feed into all of the exploratory results that I'm going to now show you. And this was to kind of figure out why we have this difference between culture that we did not expect in terms of if this volitional control is cognitively demanding. So we are going to look at task performance and task trade-off to kind of try to answer these questions. And here we do have 2 hypotheses. So we have one, which is the greater resource hypothesis, which says that maybe our Kansas participants just had greater cognitive resources available to them, and that's why they weren't as impacted by the predicted decrement that we thought would occur with the volitional attention task. Or it could be for the reserving resource hypothesis that Kansas didn't really have greater cognitive resources than Kyoto. Rather, they were trading off to reduce their cognitive load to make it easier for them to complete everything, which would then result in not finding the predicted decrement that we would expect. Excuse me. Okay, so first we're going to start with that NBAC cognitive load performance. So we have our main outcome measure is the average NBAC that participants had. This is split by the condition they were in, if it was the comic or the map. Blue will be Kansas and red will be Kyoto. Overall, we see no support for the greater resource hypothesis. where we have a cultural difference, but it's actually in the opposite direction. Overall, Kyoto is performing at about 86%, where Kansas is about 81. So this is the opposite of what we would expect if Kansas just had more cognitive resources naturally. So then when we move into the map performance, we're looking now at our main outcome is average map performance. And this measure of map performance takes into account the number of objects or locations that were correctly depicted, as well as the spatial locations and the relationships between those objects. So we used the Gardoni map analyzer to take care of these map analyses basically, and to have a more or less standardized way of rewarding credit and measuring performance. So we are again in this figure, we're splitting across location. So Kansas is on the left, Kyoto is on the right, and along the bottom, we're splitting by if they had cognitive load or not during this map task. So here we again see no support for the greater resource hypothesis. We do have a cultural difference, but again, in the opposite direction. And we do have a cognitive load difference where NBAC is overall less compared to the no NBAC. This is more or less a manipulation check for us to make sure that that cognitive load is doing what we want it to do, and that it would require participants to sort of more narrowly focus their attention. So then, since we did not find support for the idea that Kansas just had more resources available, we're now looking at an interaction and a potential task trade-off effect. So we're looking at proportion of deviation again as our main outcome. In-back performance is along the bottom. And then each of our individual panels represents a level of map performance. So the top left means that they received no credit for the map that they gave us, all the way down to the bottom right, which is going to be that 0.46, which is the highest level that we had of map performance. Our blue lines are for Kansas participants, and our red lines are for Kyoto. So here we technically have no support for the resource reserving hypothesis. There is no difference in our performance between cultures as in-back increases or as map performance increases. We see just sort of a steady difference. Nothing is changing. But we are using generalized multi-level modeling techniques to do all of our analyses, and those techniques do a really good job at treating missing data. And for this reason, it's possible that our model is extrapolating at some of those higher levels of map performance, specifically for our Kansas participants. So we just did a visual inspection of just the raw data. And what we see here is that we do have visual support for the resource reserving hypothesis, the idea that Kansas is trading off at some of those higher levels of map performance, where we really only see Kyoto data. There's only one Kansas data point in those two higher levels. And even at the 0 square, we see a larger proportion of Kansas data compared to Kyoto, suggesting that this is something that Kansas is doing, where they're trading off their task performance to be able to maintain throughout. So then to get into the discussion, we'll first look at mandatory attention, where we did find support for this hypothesis overall, where there was evidence for cultural differences in attentional selection, where Kansas had relatively more exploratory eye movements compared to Kyoto participants. When we get into the volitional attention, we did find that the tyranny of film can be broken by top-down effects on attention. With the volitional attention, we had the map task effect, and with mandatory attention, we had cultural effect. So both types of top-down attention are impacting the tyranny of film. Then when we look at this, though, and we consider the cognitive demand of the volitional control during film viewing, Volitional control, or volitional attention, excuse me, is cognitively demanding, which explains why it's not naturally something that's engaged in by viewers. This was evident for our Kyoto participants in their eye movements, where we saw that larger drop in their overall deviation. But this was also evident for our Kansas participants by choosing to not engage in the dual task fully, which is what our exploratory analyses showed. Now, future directions should try to eliminate this dual task paradigm that we were dealing with those really tricky task trade-off kind of issues. Using something like EEG or fMRI could show differences in activation between volitional and mandatory attention to identify if there is a difference in how these two types of top-down attention are impacting our attentional selection during film viewing. We also want to continue to look into the comic task scoring. So Kansas showed a similar pattern when you look at Kansas in the comic task with the in-back, so that red bar in the comic task for Kansas. They have a similar larger drop in their deviation compared to what we found with Kyoto in our original three-way interaction, suggesting that there's something fundamentally different for Kansas during the comic task. When we do our preliminary analyses, because we just finished scoring all of the comic data, we do see that there's no cultural difference in comic performance, but we still need to compare the comic task to the map task in performance. So we are working on a way to do that as equally as possible so that we're treating both levels of performance accurately. And then finally, we need to investigate if we're really breaking the tyranny of film, or if it's possible that there are just multiple types of tyranny of film within each culture, as opposed to between cultures there being one type of tyranny of film. This is something that we are looking into as our direct next step here, as well as the comic task scoring that we're working on currently. But the main takeaways from this are that cultural background does play a role in attentional selection. There are two distinct modes of top-down attention that have an impact when viewing film. And these two types of top-down attention really need to start to be teased apart in the eye movement research, so that we can better and more accurately control for or measure the influences that both of these types of top-down attention are having while we're watching film. So I want to thank you all for your attention today. I appreciate you taking the time to check out my presentation. If you have any questions, my live discussion, there's the date and time for you. I'm looking forward to talking with you if you have questions. And yeah, so that is all I have for you today. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I look forward to chatting with you. Bye.